Today we're going to be talking about the book Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about why we should not romanticize Lolita. So you've probably seen the image of a young girl with blue eyes wearing heart-shaped glasses, lollipop, and funny thing is, the iconic heart-shaped sunglasses didn't actually appear in Nabokov's original work. But anyways, you also might have seen a quote, "Light of my life, fire of my loins," posted as a caption on Tumblr or Instagram along with an image of a white skinny girl. Or maybe you've stumbled across fan-made edits which showcase clips of the movie with background music. So before reading Lolita, I actually imagined it to be a love story because of all the references in pop culture I saw before reading it. However, only when reading the book does one realize how disturbing the story is. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm not going to have any spoilers, but I did want to have some context. Basically, the story is about a man named Humbert who admits straight off that he has always been attracted to young girls, and then he goes into detail about the ages of the girls he finds attractive. And then we later find out that this attraction is because of leftover symptoms of losing his first love, Annabelle Lathe, whom he knew as a child. And then he explains how he finds older women repulsive, and how he has to satisfy his urges with nymphettes, young girls between the ages of 9 and 14. I definitely think Lolita is a highly misunderstood classic. It is very controversial because, the premise of the story itself is actually awful and completely perverted, because it forces us to basically sympathize with the villain. But it's beautifully written, and in my opinion, it is worth reading for these exact reasons. People are often easy to blame the victims, or they're easy to blame someone. However, in the case of Lolita, readers should read Lolita because the novel is an excellent example of how abusive people in abusive relationships are not always these obviously bad monsters. And this is unfortunately a common occurrence in popular media and consumption. It's called misaimed fandom, where the audiences completely fail to grasp the creator's original intentions. I definitely think this is the case with Nabokov's work, because Nabokov depicted Humbert as a man who objectified Lolita to the extent where he was unable to see her as anything but as an nymphet. So the novel is supposed to be the story of a monster, and it never attempts to humanize him or even contextualize his actions. Sadly, a lot of people do misinterpret this book, which is why it's so controversial and banned in first place. So, how do we go from a book that served as a warning for an abusive relationship to its romanticization? First of all, it's worth noting that the aesthetic of the book by Vladimir Nabokov is completely different from the Japanese street style from the 70s, that is also called Lolita. And this style was influenced by Victorian clothing and styles from the Rococo period. And I believe it actually has pretty feminist roots, and once again, it has nothing to do with the book. And if you look around social media, you can actually see the return to hyper-feminine fashion, which encourages all things girly and beautiful, which is the aesthetic of the book Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. And this type of aesthetic is based on Paris, ballerinas, dresses with frilly details, makeup, bows, Mary Jane shoes. And from an outlook, this trend may seem completely harmless and beautiful. And personally, I do think that to some extent, it is completely harmless and beautiful. Personally, I really enjoy Paris. I like frilly dresses, and I love ballet. I do ballet myself, and I think it's completely harmless. I think if you take it out of context and begin to romanticize it along with the book Lolita, that's a problem. And it's often called the coquette aesthetic, or Lolita, or sometimes even Dolette. And in the story, Humbert actually nicknames Dolores Lolita and Dolly, which now, thinking about it, actually makes complete sense because Dolores is pretty much constantly controlled, kind of like a doll. So yeah, side note, her name is not Lolita, it's Dolores Hayes. And this tells us that Humbert does not actually see Dolores as an actual person. She's a concept, an item, an object, a doll. Lolita is not a girl, but instead she's more of like a dream and a fantasy to Humbert. I actually personally think that a movie of Lolita shouldn't have ever been created. Not every book should have a movie adaptation, and that's something that Hollywood needs to understand. This is definitely the case with Lolita because the whole purpose of the book is that you begin to sympathize with Humbert. Because of the style and tone he writes in, it's purposely manipulative. And unreliable narrators can be very difficult to portray in a movie since we see the world through third person instead of first person view. I've heard the idea that a Lolita movie could portray Lolita as an object, like instead of having an actress, it could have images that we associate or connect to Lolita, like for example, lollipops and maybe shattered lollipops, butterflies, moths, images of nymphs. All these could reference the innocence of her childish nature. I've also heard about the concept of turning the movie into sort of psychological thriller slash horror, and maybe that could work because I definitely think the movies that we have at the moment contributed to the overall romanticization of the novel. So now we're going to be talking about the cover. Vladimir Nabokov actually did not want Dolores to become a cover girl for his book. He requested an American landscape in a letter to his first American publisher. He said, "I want pure colors, melting clouds, accurately drawn details, a sunburst above a receding road with the light reflected in furrows and ruts after rain, and no girls. And no girls." The cover of the book sets the initial impression on a reader, and the mental image we have of the book is a girl wearing heart-shaped sunglasses. And this image was actually made iconic by Stanley Kubrick's 1962 film adaptation of the book. So yeah, I mean, I definitely think that this cover conveys the false impression of Lolita as a young seductress, when in fact the character was abused by her stepfather, and the infamous Humbert robbed her of her youth. So yeah, I really don't like this cover actually. So we actually have the image of a lollipop being shattered in this cover, and I really like this one because it references the idea of something innocent being damaged. Then we also have this one, which is a reference to the tip of the tongue taking a trip of 3 steps down the pipe to tap at 3 on the teeth. Lolita. So I quite like this one actually. And then we have this one, and it's basically the word Lolita against a pink backdrop, so blurred and out of focus we can barely read it, to basically reference how Lolita is a dream, a fantasy. And then we have this one of Humbert, and it's actually awful to look at, but in my opinion it's the most accurate one because the book isn't about Lolita, it's about him and his twisted worldview. So it does make you uncomfortable, but in my opinion that's exactly how the book should make you feel. And we have my cover, so this is the one I have, and I actually kind of like this one because it's sinister and it's black and white. And we have obviously like the shadows that once again add to the mystery. It doesn't look like the book is actually a thriller or a psychological horror as I mentioned previously. So I also like how it portrays the male gaze, and I mean the twisted knee here indicates fear. But yeah, basically these sorts of covers that I actually prefer a lot more than the one in the film relate more to Lolita's loss of youth and her dehumanization. But yeah, if you search in the internet, you can find tons of other covers from tons of other countries as well. So, although Nabokov's request was explicit, today the name of Lolita does not bring melting clouds or sunbursts or receding roads. It calls the image of a girl, a teenage seductress with red lips wearing heart-shaped glasses. And Dolores was never a seductress, she was a victim. Now I'm going to be talking about references. I would like to mention that there is a very fine line between the romanticization of the novel and its use as a symbol for abuse an artist could have experienced. I think a great example of this is Lana Del Rey, an American singer that often references Lolita in her songs and lyrics. She has faced a lot of criticism because of it, like many other artists who use lollipops or stuffed animals for their own artistic purposes. And many have pointed that behind these vintage aesthetics, there lies a horrific story of a 12-year-old who was abused by a 37-year-old man. However, we have to consider the context of these references. Lana Del Rey talked about her own experiences of abuse and how many times her music is a way for her and for many other young girls and women to express and connect themselves. Speaking about references, I would also like to mention 2 books who frequently allude to Lolita. One of them is called My Dark Vanessa by Elizabeth Russell, and this book basically feels like a modern take on Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita. The main character goes through an abusive relationship between her and an older man, and this book tries answering the question of what would happen to Dolores if the story was told from her perspective. And it also covers the effects of childhood trauma and what that would look like as she grew older. It's very interesting but very disturbing, so a huge warning to anyone planning to read the novel. I also read Being Lolita recently, and this one is a memoir that shines on preconceptions of consent, vulnerability, and power. Also, a very interesting take on Lolita. So, what has captivated readers for decades about the abusive relationship between a man and a child? As I mentioned previously, the beauty of the novel is in the language. The mastery of language is what allows the narrator to feel so sophisticated while reading the book. So it's understandable why so many girls begin to romanticize this book. However, the real issue is when uneducated and impressionable people who have not read the book or misread it come across it and begin to idealize the image of Lolita. So yeah, that's all I have to say. Thank you for watching.